We know that from neuropsychology and psychology studies that there's something called brain plasticity, that brains are plastic or malleable at very young ages based on their input. So the toys you play with, the talking to or not, all these things have an impact on the development of our neural pathways. So we're giving infants now iPads and smartphones in the bassinets, in the cribs, et cetera, before they're acquiring language, which tells me that their brains are going to be wired differently than yours. They're going to think differently than you do. We don't know what all the implications of that are yet, but that's what's happening. It's really interesting because kids are now more used to, and the studies are showing this, kids are more likely to talk with, let's say, call it talking, with their best friends with a device than they are face-to-face. So they're more used to mediated communications. And I can tell you some of the impacts. I've seen it firsthand, again, with the college students coming in, young students. They're less likely to emote on their face. So they're not as good at reading nonverbal cues or giving nonverbal cues because they use emojis and texts and things, emojis being prosthetic emotions in a sense. So their face is mute, but they're laughing wildly and crying, they're laughing so hard with an emoji. So then they don't have to signal that with their face. So if you're talking to them, for example, happiness, mute face, sadness, mute face, excitement, mute face. So, you're going to see some maybe cross-age miscommunications as a result of that. I had a student, for example, she went to an internship, and I overheard her talking to another student in my class saying, well, my boss, he told me something and he didn't apparently get the reaction he wanted to get. So I just envisioned a delicious pizza, and that gave the face that he wanted to see or was expecting to see. So, this workaround to give an emotion face tells you everything in a sense. So there's some of those interesting things going on that are very subtle, but that will have a big impact, again, especially across age communication and in face-to-face communication. Also things like calling on the phone. People talk about calling up and then an awkward silence. Less experience making phone calls, how to break the ice on a cold call, how to talk to somebody, how to start the conversation. So even conversations in themselves as opposed to texting. So the art of conversation. So in the business world, they're going to have to do some 101 training on stuff that you never would have thought of before, like how to make a cold call. Particularly very young children, the thinking is to limit their exposure to digital technologies. Very, very young children having the face-to-face time, interacting with them. Otherwise, it is kind of an isolating thing. Here, using it as a sort of digital babysitter in a sense. So there's some thinking about that, just limiting it. And also, I would say for the family and for the relationships and for practicing these skills we're talking about, setting aside what we could call sacred spaces where you don't have a device. Like, for example, the family dinner table. Let's just have our devices set aside and check in with everybody, have an actual conversation, learn to connect. And even though at first it might be difficult or awkward, eventually I think even the kids are going to appreciate that little time off. And I guess I want to say here, since the inception, there are qualities baked into these apps that make you want to keep coming back for more. They're, in a sense, addictive in a way. So, it's very hard to make that time, but you have to be conscious about it. A little more conscious use of technology, I guess.